I'm drinking green tea. I've got a green rug, I've got green wall panels, I've got some green speakers behind me. Everything has gone green. And today we are looking at the small streaming active speakers that you see behind me, and they are made by KEF. They're called the LSX2 LT, and as the name suggests, these are a slightly stripped down version of the LSX2. And the LT stripped down feature set comes with a stripped down price, €999 per pair. And we're going to assess the LT with 3 side-by-side comparisons using music that you might read about in Rolling Stone, on Stereo Gum, and over at Pitchfork.
This episode is brought to you by Munich High-End, the world's leading international audio show, running May 9 through 12 at the MOC.
Welcome back, everybody. Yes, the LSX2 LT is still a UniQ two-way speaker where the tweeter and the mid-bass driver are coaxially and coincidentally aligned. And the LT still puts the same amplifier array in each speaker, so essentially we get 1 amp per driver because this is an active loudspeaker. And the LT also inherits its bigger brother's W2 streaming platform. But to get the retail price under €1,000, KEF ditched the cloth wraparound, it ditched the auxiliary input and the Roon readiness, and also the wireless interlink. So the primary speaker now hands off power and audio to the secondary speaker using KEF's proprietary C-Link cable. And KEF put a 3 meter length of C-Link inside the box, which is long enough if you want to put the LT on a low board to improve your TV sound quality. And I strongly urge you to do that instead of getting a bloody soundbar, if only to get proper left to right stereo separation. And yes, HDMI ARC is still part of the deal here. However, audio nerds like me and possibly you will want to get the LT up onto stands to put the tweeter at ear level when we're sitting down. And KEF's custom S1 stands will run you another €350. Now those stands' central column offers cable management, which I think is crucial, absolutely crucial, to lowering the visual intrusion of cable vomit, because no one likes to see cable vomit spewing off the back of any loudspeaker really. And those stands make the 8 meter version of the C-Link cable pretty much an essential extra, and that's another €60. Now through the primary speaker stand, I routed a mains cable, the C-Link cable, an HDMI cable, and a Toslink cable for a CD transport. And I also added a subwoofer cable, but we'll get to that in a bit. So my journey with the LT started back in Portugal with a white pair replacing the standard LSX2 on my office desk. And I used the standard LSX2 for December and some of January, and then the LT for the rest of January and for February. So I guess you could call that an extended side-by-side comparison. But I built a playlist of songs just to make sure. And that includes artists like Low, Nick Drake, Eat Static, Depeche Mode, and Lana Del Rey. And if there were audible differences between the LSX2 and the LT version, I couldn't pick them. And as far as I'm concerned, from a sonic point of view, they are the same speaker. What about the PSB Alpha IQ that we covered at the end of last year? Yes, I've done that side-by-side comparison as well. The PSB are more costly than the LT, and they trade a USB input for phono staging and a line level analog input. So you should know this, that the LT have no analog inputs, they are digital only. And the PSB have a wireless interlink like the LSX2, the standard version, which means the secondary speaker needs to sit within reach of a wall socket, and we don't have that challenge with the LT. And that's because the secondary speaker is powered by the C-Link cable. Now sound-wise, the LT offer a mellower take on music than do the PSB, and I think the KEF's low end also gives the impression of less bass, even though a quick spec sheet comparison says that that's not the case. And according to those manufacturer supplied spec sheets, KEF rates the LT as 3 dB down at 54 Hz, while PSB says that the Alpha IQ are 3 dB down at 64 Hz. And that's despite the LT having the slightly larger mid-bass driver. And maybe this is why they sound tighter in the low end than the PSB, I don't know. That's for their respective engineers to tell us. Whatever the reasons, the KEF also sound more relaxed when it comes to the mid-range dynamics of Lowe's plastic cup. And they maybe, just maybe, sound a little bit smoother and less strident in the uppermost treble with the Grinderman track than the PSB do. But I wouldn't swear on that. Sometimes I think that's the case, other times not. One thing that isn't in doubt, however, is how the KEF don't extract as much detail from the EAT static cut as the PSB do. And that was a surprising finding for me. But soundstage depth is more overt in KEF hands. That means we get a better sense of front to back layering than we do from the PSB. Now, I suspect that most people would be delighted by either the KEF or the PSB speaker. So my advice here is to buy on functionality and looks more than on audio performance. I mean, think about the colors. The PSB come in a much broader range than the KEF's green or white or black, and I think that's it, whereas the PSB, it's like a rainbow of options. And then you might think about how you want to use your active speakers, because the KEF can be connected to a PC or a Mac over USB, and the PSB cannot. And that makes the PSB, for me, less suited to the desktop than the KEF. And I also have a pair of Alpha IQ in Portugal, and I think that the KEF sound better on the desktop because they sound more coherent in the near field. On the other hand, the PSB can accommodate turntables and the KEF cannot. And the PSB have on-speaker touch controls and the KEF don't. And the PSB are Roon ready and the KEF are not. I mean, I use Chromecast built-in to get my Roon fix with the LT. And then lastly, think about the price, because the PSB are 40% more expensive than the KEF. So yes, I use Roon's smartphone app to tell the Roon Nucleus One server, which is over there, to send the streams to the KEF over Chromecast because they're not Roon ready. But high-res fans should note, however, that according to Roon's own support pages, Chromecast-enabled devices can't handle anything above 48 kHz. That doesn't bug me because I don't really do high-res streaming all that often, but it might bug you if you're into that kind of thing. That said, the old Chromecast Audio Puck, the disc, can play catch on anything up to 96K. And if I really wanted that, I could connect the Google Puck to the LT's Toslink input and then power it from the USB socket that's also on the back. And we turn on the USB-C socket's power mode inside the KEF app. But my thanks go to Roon for sponsoring this video. Now, one product that recently became Roon ready is the WiiM AMP. So now we have to ask, how do the LT compare to the WiiM AMP driving the Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5 S2, which I said a few months ago was my €1,000 hi-fi system of choice for 2024. Now, in this case, all the streaming connectivity in this passive speaker system is farmed out to the WiiM AMP, whose streaming suite is broader than the LT's. So if we look at it more closely, the KEF come up short on the WiiM's Roon readiness, obviously, but also on squeeze box emulation. But I think that's a bit like complaining that your 4-course meal isn't a 6-course meal, because the LT still give us Google Chromecast, Apple AirPlay 2, Spotify Connect, and Tidal Connect, and also KEF's own streaming app, which integrates KUBE's, Tidal, and Deezer, and Amazon Music as well. Now, for this side-by-side comparison, I use the same playlist of songs as before, And I honed in on the absolutely, and I've got to say, absolutely sumptuous Poor Boy by Nick Drake. If you don't know this track, or you don't know Nick Drake, stop watching this video now. I know I'm doing myself a disservice here, but stop watching this video and go and pull up some Nick Drake on a streaming service, especially Poor Boy, because it's just glorious. Now, this track exposes the Pro-Ject speaker's more abundant top-end air, but also a slight tinge of artificiality on its more prominent upper mid-range. Now, that could be the WiiM amp's sort of lack of power going into that tweeter, I don't know, but I don't hear that issue from the KEF LSX II LT. And the upshot of that is that the KEF's vocal intelligibility isn't quite as good as the Pro-Ject's, and that's especially noticeable when watching YouTube or Netflix. Now, Voodoo Doll by Eat Static is sure to trigger the grumpies, but it tells us that the LT is a faster sounding loudspeaker than the Pro-Ject when driven by the WiiM. And another must listen in this playlist is Alessandro Cortini's remix of Depeche Mode's People Are Good, because Cortini has completely disemboweled the original song to build something quite extraordinary out of the remains. And this remix's bigger vocal sound lets us hear how the LT image more cleanly than the Pro-Ject. And it also lets us hear the illusion of soundstage depth on the KEF more than we get from the Pro-Ject when driven by the WiiM. So if you want a speaker system with the greatest zip and zing, you want the WiiM Pro-Ject combo. But if you want a cozier, more intimate sound, you want the LT. But what both systems really need is a subwoofer. KEF sent me its new KUBE 8 MIE subwoofer, which means yet another cable to route through the primary speaker stand's central column. Now, the KUBE 8 is an 8-inch front-firing model that's sealed, so there's no port. And it doesn't sound, to my ears at least, as weighty or as taut or as muscular as the more costly KC62, but I think the KUBE 8 packs more of an immediate punch. It sounds looser and freer, and that might be something to do with its front-facing driver, because remember, the KC62 fires sideways. Again, only engineers can explain why to us. And in the Pro-Ject system, the WiiM amp sets the crossover point for a 2.1 setup that actually sounds, I've got to say, downright superb. So it low passes the sub and high passes the mains, and the additional low bass plays such a nice counterpoint to the Pro-Ject's more acidic top end. But the KEF setup gives us more. So if we tell the KEF Connect app that we are using a KEF sub with our KEF actives, we get bespoke crossover settings for our particular model of sub. So in this case, note how the crossover point sits below 80 Hertz, and there's a little bit of daylight between the low pass that goes out to the sub and the high pass that goes out to the loudspeakers. And left to my own devices, I'd never have chosen those numbers myself. And we can, of course, adjust these settings. I actually nudged the sub gain back by 1 dB, but the net result of adding the sub was far better with the LSX II LT than I expected. And I guess I'm now at a point where it's becoming increasingly difficult for me to listen to a two-way stand mount loudspeaker without a subwoofer in play. Of course, there are exceptions like the Zoo DWX and the Monitor Audio Silver 107G, but they have much larger mid-bass drivers than the LT. Now, the KUBE 8 MIE, let's call it the KUBE 8, not only mines the lowest frequencies for a far more satisfying movie watching experience, but it makes the LT system sound bigger in all directions. And that's possibly because the crossover is relieving the mid-bass driver in the LT of any low bass duties. But the upshot of that is that this extra bigness challenges the R3 Meta running standalone. So can you feel another side-by-side comparison coming on? Yeah, kind of. So for home theatre applications, I would choose the LT system over the R3 standing alone because the R3, they just don't go low enough on their own without a sub. But for music, I go the other way, especially with acoustic fare. The R3 sounds more natural and more present than the LT with Lowe's plastic cup. And for music playback, even with a sub in tow, the LT, well, we wouldn't call them giant killers, but they are giant challengers. But let us not forget that the R3 Meta, sat on their matching custom stands, sell for more than the entire LT system. And that's before we consider an amplifier, a DAC and a streamer for the R3. And no, the WiiM amp is not it. It makes the R3 Meta, to my ears, sound far too threadbare. Now, as many hi-fi veterans will know, integrating a subwoofer with a pair of speakers isn't only a matter of crossover design. We also have to consider the location of the subwoofer, because the best location for your subwoofer's bass output might not be where your speakers sit. Now, the KUBE 8 is compatible with KEF's KW1 wireless connection system, and this cuts the umbilical between the speakers and the sub to allow for more flexible subwoofer placement. So last week I had my KUBE 8 placed along a side wall over here, now with the KW1 transmitter connected to the sub cable coming off the back of the LT. And that transmitter sends the low pass subwoofer output wirelessly to the KW1 receiver attached to the back of the KUBE 8. Now, would-be nitpickers should note at this point that according to KEF, the wireless latency of this KW1 system is only something like 17 milliseconds. And this experiment in subwoofer relocation for me told me that sidewall placement in my room, it just doesn't work. The bass heard at the listening position, which is right here, sounded too disconnected from the mains. I don't mean the mains power, I mean the main speakers, as in the LT. So in my room, the KUBE 8 sounds better when sat between the loudspeakers. Now, what about the KEF LS50 Meta? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't know. I can only work with what I have here at the time of reviewing, and I sold my LS50 systems in order to afford the R3 Meta. But if you don't want to sell your LS50 Wireless 2 to reach a higher level, and I can't say I would blame you, I would recommend adding a subwoofer before doing anything else. And adding a KEF sub will give you access to bespoke crossover settings as designed by the manufacturer that sit inside the app, just as we get with the LT. And following that thought process to its logical conclusion, I'd rather sit in front of the LT paired with a sub than any LS50 system running without one, because proper low-end reach is more of a priority than anything the LS50 could offer over and above the LT. At least that's the way I see it. Of course, in an ideal world, we'd have the LS50 with a sub, but this video wasn't about that. It was about the KEF LSX II LT, which I think is possibly better suited to small rooms. It can augment the sound of your TV, you can put it on a desktop, and you can stream to it. But I think that this cheaper version, in some ways, I prefer it to the original because I don't have to have the secondary speaker close to a mains power socket. And also, I think I prefer the look of the LT over and above the LSX II because I was never really a fan of the fabric wrap, but that's a personal thing. Anyway, if you like this video, click the appropriate thumb down below and hit the subscribe button if you're keen to see more content like this. Also, hit me up on Patreon if you want music playlists for this video and every other video we've made since 2020, or if you simply want to buy me a cup of coffee to say thank you for making this video or another video. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Oh, and I almost forgot. To let us know that you got all the way to the end of this video, please chuck us a what about in the comment section below.